Hi guys, look at who we have here with us today. This is Pascal Coppens and of course Ashley Dudarenok. I'm so excited to speak with Pascal today. We need to congratulate him on the launch of his latest book. And Pascal, what's the name of the book?
Well, the name of the book is Can We Trust China? So it's quite a direct title. And so, yeah, this is the name of the book, and very proud. And thanks, Ashley, for having me.
Very cool name of the book. Some people may say, is it clickbait? Is there actually an answer to this question? It's going to be an amazing discussion that we're going to have. And essentially, we're going to get a summary of what are some of the main ideas in the book, Can We Trust China? It's been recently released on Amazon, and it is also available in a print version across the globe. So guys, if you see it anywhere online or offline, definitely get yourself a full version. So now, without further promotion and ado, I would like to ask you, really, Pascal, why did you write this book?
Well, very good question, Ashley. Well, actually, to answer that first question on the clickbait, maybe I should say that something. So there is an answer in the book, but it's at the last page of the book. So you have to read the first 325 pages before getting there. But it is a little bit clickbait as well, because in a way, I explain within the book that this is a binary question, which you would give a binary answer towards. And the book is all about not thinking binary and thinking differently. And so yes, it's a little bit of clickbait, but it's also the question that I think many people are faced with today, or asking themselves. And so even though there's maybe not the direct answer to the question, the question is being asked many times. And so why did I write this book? Well, it's a very good question in the way that actually I wasn't planning to write this book. I was planning to write a follow-up on my first book, China's New Normal, which is, as you know, about innovation and technology and yeah, how China is starting to set the standard and really going very fast. But then I found back in 2020, 2021, when we were all in COVID lockdown in Europe, that people were asking less and less questions about the advancements and the change of China from a technology point of view, and they really wanted to know some of the more geopolitical and why is China doing lockdowns and what does that mean, and so there was a lot of emotional questions. And so I thought I need to answer first another question is, well, do we actually trust what's happening in China before we can learn from it? Because if you don't trust someone, it's hard to learn from it. So that's where my book Trust became central, because I thought, yeah, we first need to tackle this. And so that's what the book is about.
And I think that you are so right in that sense, because human to human, right? If you want to learn from someone, trust comes first. Do I think you have my common interest or our common interest as a human race or as a team at heart? Only if I trust you, then I can learn and I can excel, etc. And this is, again, a fundamental question that I think based on geopolitical and business and other developments globally right now, a lot of people are asking. There was a very interesting concept. It's called the Qubit mindset. I found it quite appealing. What do you mean by that?
Well, that's a little bit what I was just mentioning about the binary mindset. So in the West in general, and I don't want to generalize the West, but let's say many Western countries, specifically where I'm from in Western Europe, we often like to put things in boxes, and so this is how we think. Like we are democratic, and China is an autocracy, and China is a communist party, and so we put this in boxes, and so we like to say it's either this or that. And having lived in China myself for 20 years and being with the people and learned to trust my friends in China, I've learned that many Chinese, if not most of them, are actually having a more, you could say it, holistic view. And so I call that a qubit mindset. And a qubit from quantum physics, and I'm not going to explain quantum physics here, that would take too long, and I'm not sure I'm able to do that anyway. But the reality is that in quantum physics, I mean, a bit, it's not about ones and zeros. It's about, it could be one, it could be zero, it could be both, it could be repositioned. And so basically there's many states that things could be in. And it's only when you analyze the context, learn the context, and trust that context, and basically figure it out over time, that you open that box and then suddenly say, oh, it's a one or it's a zero. And so that's the qubit mindset. And I think we too often in the West, when we look at China, are putting it into a box, even before having analyzed the context, or at least empathize with how Chinese think about the context. And so the qubit mindset is really about how Chinese are constantly trying to circle around things to try and figure out what is happening and then finally make that decision. But once they do, it's very direct and they're serious about it. But that's the qubit mindset. It's about not just having an opinion, but doubting your own opinion, but by doing analytics and figuring out what's happening on the ground. So but there's a lot more to it.
Absolutely.
Thinking in circles.
Absolutely. And I think it's, again, when you look at any complex situation, any complex puzzle, any complex country, right? It's very difficult. It's also very simplistic. Or even a person. You look at a person, you say, oh, somebody's good or bad. Something's black or white, right? Or like Chinese consumers like this. No, they are not. There are 1.4 billion people, and they are all very different. Whether they work in live in South China or North China, what's their age? What's their, I do not know, hobbies? What's their environment? What's their aspiration in life, right? So it's basically just separating kind of the, functional direction from, these big boxes. Very cool, I find it.
It's also something that I just to interrupt you for 1 minute, I also relate this to the fact that China can live with different concepts. And that's sometimes very difficult for us, specifically in Western Europe, to
understand
that, to understand
that it can be very free in some areas,
very
and very
free,
constrained,
very constrained in others, or that a dictatorship is promoting entrepreneurship, or that, I mean, that a communist party is doing certain things that you would say this would never happen in our logic. And so I think that polarizing world that we are so used in, very often it's either this or that. China can live with contradictions. And that's also within that qubit mindset.
And not only live, but function and flourish. I think that's that's probably also it. Function really and flourish in some areas. That's beautiful. So when we look at the book, you actually have the China lens and Western lens before you actually go into your chapters, right? You kind of introduce these different concepts, and you say, here is how China lens works, and this is how Western lens works. It is a very polarizing view one way, but the other way, maybe not. So why did you do that? Why did you introduce the Chinese and Western lens at the beginning of the book?
So after my introduction, which I talk about this qubit and binary thinking and so on, and how we can look at China differently, I made a new chapter, which I added at the end, actually, after writing my book, because I thought, before I start explaining everything in detail about how I see the Chinese trust environment and how the Chinese look at trust, I think I should put the black and white next to each other and really polarize, not with the intention to polarize, but to show how binary our mindset has become and how we are thinking about China very often outside China, and how Chinese are starting to think about the world as well. And so this is becoming binary. And so I put really 9 different statements in there that I thought these are things that people really believe very strongly in the West. And the question is, we often know this as Westerners, myself, I mean, and most of my friends, they will tell you, China is they're copycats, or they're like a dictatorship, or they're violating human rights. And so all these things are very true. that these things happen. But then the question is, how do Chinese think about these same things? And so I thought I'm going to make like 9 comparisons on left and right page. I just had 1 page size, so I had to minimize because every topic could have become a book on itself. But basically, I've then said, how do Chinese think about these 9 really challenging questions or very, very emotional questions that people are talking about? And the idea was to do that to also, once you've read all this, then I wanted to know, but I don't know that, of course, how the reader, did he feel more comfortable with the Western lens or with the Chinese lens? And so that was my question to the audience. And then I start my book. But
and just to give you guys an idea, because you may be, oh my God, what are you talking about? So for instance, let's take a few examples. Western lens, the Chinese steal, copy, and spy. The Chinese lens to the same question is the West has China as a straitjacket. Okay.
Yes.
The next one is Western lens. Everything from China is junk. The Chinese lens, you get for what you pay, right?
Yes.
Then we have Western lens. China's ideology is not compatible with others, and Chinese lens is the West doesn't own, the patent on democracy. It can be many things, right? So this is what you've done. You've really put it into very practical, really views on common and important big themes. Moving on, when it comes to misconceptions, because you mentioned some misconceptions about China in your book. What are those misconceptions, apart from the ones that I've mentioned, that you think are the most difficult to battle or correct or to address?
Yes, so Ashley, there's of course a lot of misconceptions about China. Now there's a lot of misconceptions in China about the world as well. But my book was about China. It's not about the world. So I wrote about the things that I believe, and through my experience, that if we look at China in a different way from how mostly the Chinese look at China, as I understand it, there's things that we will look at China in another way. And one of the main misconceptions in my view, I mean, there's like a dozen, but let's say the 4 main ones. It's really about this. We often see China and Beijing as a top-down society where people just have to do whatever Beijing says and basically just live in fear somehow that Beijing would decide something. And so this top-down society, I think I've explained in my book very well how strong the bottom-up is, and how even within the government, it's a bottom-up leadership, bottom-up meritocracy to move up the ranks. And so it's really, there's more, my experience as an entrepreneur, and I think with you as well, in China, it's real. I mean, the power often and the energy comes from the people, and
also the power to rule, right? With this mandate of heaven, that was given in more cultural kind of sense.
That is something I explain in my last chapter, but definitely, I think that's one of the things. So China is not. Don't look purely from a top-down society, because you're going to miss out a lot of the things that are happening in China. And put China in that box because of that. I think the rigid is another thing. I mean, we always say China is very static. I mean, nothing's if you look at the lockdowns that we had in Shanghai, people are thinking like, wow, nothing's possible, and there's no freedom whatsoever to move around. And people believe that China is very rigid. At the same time, many people will say China is constantly changing. It's very dynamic. And so there's a misunderstanding between, is it rigid or is it dynamic? And so we're almost putting that in the same phrase, and that's not possible. And so for me, that China is much more dynamic than we believe so. So especially when we have this top-down view, we should also consider a dynamic top-down view. and not a rigid top-down view, and maybe a more rigid bottom-up view. But I think that's where I think the misunderstanding is. And this is about change, but also about China being cyclical and so on. And I explained that in my book, just like you said. There's moments of control and there's moments of letting go. And in between, that's where China's really flourishing and things are happening. So I think the rigid, the top-down is one of the things. And then, of course, the big elephant in the room is freedom. I mean, do the Chinese have freedom? And so this is where I also think we're misreading or misunderstanding how much freedom Chinese feel they have themselves. And this has to do a little bit with the culture. That they're used to certain boundaries and regulations and environments that are more comfortable than they would be in Belgium, for example, where I'm from, but also to do with the fact that they've gained a lot of freedom over time. And we don't, so it's an evolution or evolutionary environment, which we don't look at. We look at it as a static, top-down, non-free environment. And I've tried to
loosen it up a bit.
To change that a little bit, not to challenge it, but to actually to say it's wrong, but to say that is not the only view. And then I made a whole new model around the collective as well, which is the other thing, the collective and the individual.
And exactly, let's move to this collective versus individual, because you talk about this model into your book. So you've mentioned that it's so important to understand the model of modern China being collective versus individual. How does this model work? What does it actually mean? How to apply it?
Yeah, so the model is actually pretty simple, but it's something that I created as I was writing the book. I was putting things in boxes myself to say, this is that, this is that. And so every time I was writing things throughout the book, I was saying, this is more a collective way of thinking. This is more an individualistic way of thinking. And I came to the conclusion through my writing that actually China is as individualistic as the West, and the West is as collectivistic as China. And the only difference is that we look at it from a different point of view. And the model is basically, I separated throughout my book, I call that the circles of trust. And the whole book is about the circles of trust, which means that you have the inner circles, which is your network, the guanxi, like they say in Chinese, the relationship, everybody you know, or you have a connection with. And then the outer circles is the system, whatever that may mean. It could go the party, the government, it could be the world, it could be anything that you don't have an impact on, but that has a lot of impact on your life because you're born in a certain environment. And so you have to stick with it somehow. It's part of you. And so these outer circles and these inner circles, this is where I see in the West, we are much more collectivistic from our outer circles, from a system point of view, and individualistic from a network point of view. And in China, it's the opposite. And so we understand that from a network point of view, that people who know each other, I mean, they're collectivistic and they want to stick together and help each other and protect each other. But then from a system point of view, we don't always understand that China is actually very individualistic, which means that both the system wants to help the people, that's why they call it often a people-centric society, to move forward. And the people trust somehow the system that it will help them move forward. I'm not saying all the Chinese, but definitely in general, they're more individualistic in trusting the system. We are more collectivistic when we look at the system. And so putting these two as a mirror, then I started going back in my book and say, does this all fit? And for more than 90% of all the things that we think about China, if you just switch that model, it makes it a lot more easy to understand how Chinese think and why they do things that are completely strange to us or weird. And it's because of this collectivistic individual. So it's the we and the me that is actually turned around from system and from the network. And for me, it's really about, and because the system is something about protecting the collective, while in China, it's within the network. And so that means that when we look at Chinese system, we often believe it's about control and protecting, because that's how we think in the West. We think from a collective protection point of view. Well, we should look at it from a progress point of view, like they do, but we do that more into our inner circle. So that's the simple model. I mean, it took me a little bit longer to explain here, but it's a quite simple model, which helps for most of the things to understand China in a different way.
And this is the power of writing as well. When you write things down, so many things become obvious, right? It's
Yes.
just a very powerful tool. And I love it how such a complex, of course, herd of ideas can become very simple with a simple model. And for, as you said, 90% of situations, it can provide a valid shortcut
Yes.
to, you know, to a better thinking and ultimately better solution. When it comes to your next chapter, you talk about friends and family, so inner circle in many ways, and you also cover a couple of we can call them consumer groups, or, you know, Chinese segment groups, right? The leftover women, for example, or families that are living apart, the silver-haired generation, China's women warriors, etc. And in the business community, this is the golden pot. That's where the money is. That's what everybody in the business community is trying to really understand and sell to them, market to them, introduce products for them and to them. However, as we said, China, even when you bulk them into leftover women, is so big and so complex that it's very difficult to truly understand those consumer groups. In your view, what are some of the ways or thinking methods or business tools that can help businesses and other invested parties, let's say, to better understand the real Chinese people, or in their business slang, we can sell the consumers?
The consumers, yeah. Well, I think that's more your job than mine, but I totally, no, you're doing an excellent job at that. I think that people should all follow your channel and your writings to know more about the consumer. What I did in the book is really to address this from a misconception point of view. And so very often when we look at Chinese consumers or people, or citizens, then we look at it from a very big group, one collective. They're all the same, and that's what I wanted to address. We have to break this down. And so when you say the silver hair generation, or I wrote about that as well as the leftover woman and married woman and their challenges in family and how they want to both go into the future for themselves, but at the same time are stuck a little bit with tradition. I think this is kind of like this triangle of making choices. And what we often forget when we look at Chinese consumer groups is that every individual is trying to make his own choices based on a lot of parameters, which are very not uniform at all. And so I just try to explain a little bit that these groups are actually very powerful, and that and when we read them in the media, in Western media very often, specifically in America, we often we see some of these groups as like being controlled or non-existent. I mean, we talk about demography problems of older people, and so but we don't talk about the opportunity and how they're progressing. We're talking about the problems that China has with them. We're talking about the problems of I mean, what you have with some women that have been harassed just recently. I mean, it's often look at it from a negative point of view. Well, actually, there's so much happening there. And so in my book, I was trying to describe all that and show that there's so much power in that individual, in that person. And that even if it's a very small niche, I mean, it's a huge market in China. So we have to take this serious, because that on itself, I mean, if I compare with Belgium, I mean, the smallest niche group is bigger than all the consumers in Belgium. So we should really take that into account. So, but putting it in a context of why individuals are moving throughout the evolution, that's part of that trust level that we have to have in the Chinese consumer and citizen.
And when it comes to, as you said, really trying to connect with these people, yes, there are niches, but there's also right now so much focus that all these large tech giants are putting into personalized consumer journeys.
Oh, yes.
Consumer-centric, Why? Because you can be a very niche group, the lover of sneakers with the, I do not know, Molly, the blind box hero logo on it. You can be the lover of this, you can follow, you can have a fan club. But then again, individual choices, preferences, circumstances, they are not just different, but in China, they're evolving with China's speed. So by the time you finished your strategy and ready to implement your advertising, sales, marketing, whatever campaign, or Lord forbid, issue a physical product, circumstances will change. So that is why in China right now, because of a huge population, because of the fact that we have so many different groups, because of the fact that we have big kind of government plan where the whole economy and the China world is going, because we have tech giants, we are actually reinventing this business model, right? How businesses can innovate together with consumers almost on the individual one-on-one basis. Yes. That's where personalization comes in. And then how you can quickly push out product ideas, marketing, So it's of course there are flows and directions, but it just becomes very, very complex when you look at it from kind of Western standpoint, because you don't know what's going on, right? So guys,
and I definitely added this personalization, and I think that's what I wrote in the book, is to look at them as individuals, and so communication also have to go as an individual. I mean, the whole thing about key opinion consumers and live streaming and everything that's happening, this is about people, and so there's no place on the planet where it's going so crazy, because they want to reach every person individual. And so within trust, I've tried to really explain that the individual is central to the whole story of trust in China. So that was my first chapter, because if you don't trust the individual, I mean, you're not going to trust China. That's as simple as that.
And that is why it's very sad also right now that we are in the virtual isolation, between many countries outside of Asia and mainland China. Because if you have a Chinese friend, if you actually physically travel to mainland, if you know these people, you can find that reference point. You can start trusting China from one person, from a group of people, and then kind of into the broader community one way or another. You have also in your book developed a leadership model from China, and you talk about it in your chapter 3. What are the main differences with the Western model? What can we learn from it?
Yeah, so my book, Ashley, is built out of circles of trust. And so the first one, which we talked about, the individual, then you have the family and friends, which is a lot about culture. And then the third one is really about the leadership and company and team. And what surprised me when I was researching about this topic about companies is that there's very, very little writings that you can find on Chinese leadership. I mean, there's a lot about consumers and about marketing, about branding, about lots of things. I mean, everything about WeChat and mini apps and mini programs and whatever you want. But if you want to learn about leadership, it's very little. And we know that some companies like an Alibaba, Tencent, all these big companies that we know as brands in the West, we know that they've been surviving in a world that has been really tough. And also and we often look at these business models and say, oh, this is how we want to become agile. We should add speed and learn from China about speed or scale, and so we have all these buzzwords that we look at China. This is how but we forget that there's leaders behind that, and that there's actually people that make that happen. It's not just only the market. Of course, the market helps, but it's also the people that drive it. And so I've created like 4 different leadership styles. I mean, they are existing. I just put them in a certain box for people to understand more easily. where I've put certain companies in there, Chinese companies, to understand what type of leadership that is, and bring that back to the culture of China, which is about Confucianism, it's about Daoism, it's about legalism. So I went a little bit back into the culture and explain how survival leadership, like a Wúwèi environment, is different, and how this is all about trusting the relationship, the guanxi. Explain more about the more performance leadership, like a Ping An, where it's all about data and scale and so on, and so how they do that. And also then more in the Daoism leadership, which is more like higher, which is ecosystem leadership, or I call that the godmother leadership. And so there's kind of like 4 different leadership styles I put in there. But the whole idea was to actually bring back the things that we think, this is really cool about China. This is what we need to learn in the West, because everything's changing today, and we're living in uncertain times, and so there's survival for many of us. And so look at China, but instead of looking at China, look at their leaders and look at how they actually managed the companies, and the founders created the company, and how they went forward. And in all of this has to do with trust. And so this is going back to my book. It's about trust of the relationship, of the network, trust about technology, trust about people. And so I've put that in 4 different categories to make it easy. But of course, none of these companies is purely one or the other. But there's some companies that are more prominent in one style of leadership. And so my hope is that many people can learn from Chinese leaders, like they've learned from Amazon and from Google and other leaders, and IBM and GE. We should look at the Chinese leadership model. So that's my 3rd chapter, and maybe I'm going to write more about that in the future, because it's an interesting topic. Yes,
I think it's a much needed update from the art of war. How many decades, whenever we spoke about China, it was, have you read The Art of War? And then, they always, literally, I think even I've attended a seminar or some virtual talk where somebody told us that, Chinese always approach everything as if there's war operation. Have you read The Art of War? It needs to be a book on your desk, and every single situation in business is a battle. Oh my goodness, right? So it's a much needed 2022 update onto the art of war leadership style. And Pascal, what is your favorite out of the 4 that you've mentioned leadership style that you think serves specifically quick and innovative companies best in China today?
So if you talk about Chinese companies, or you're talking about Western companies? For Chinese companies, well, the thing is that the Ford model, which is actually a kind of a mix of Western plus Chinese management style or leadership style, I think is the one that will survive, because it's a combination of the first 3 plus a Western flavor. I could say, I don't want to call it Western, but it's more international flavor, where certain where the people, empowering of the people is actually put central. And so I see this more with younger companies. And so when I look at these leadership styles, some are more fit to China because of its history, and it's some more fit because of its culture. Some are more fit because of the change of China. And I think the last leadership style, which I really think is about empowerment, is one that is more about the future. And so this is why I think the future is where it's, so the cocktail of the past 3 and adding that empowerment of individuals and the creativity. I think that's the main thing. And in my book, I took C-Trip as one of the examples, trip.com, of how they care really about their staff and their environment, and want to grow together. So I think that's really the one that I would see for the future, the most possible or best fit.
So the future is the blend. The future is coming together of West and East, and this is, I think, the big picture and the big message and the big idea. I love it.
Thanks for helping me there.
In our chapter 4 of the book, you also speak about another very cool concept, and it is a Daoist way of making a change. We call it Wúwèi, right? Non-action. That's the translation of Wúwèi. So can you explain a bit the concept of Wúwèi and how does it contribute to China's silent revolution? Why should we know about it?
Yeah. So in my 4th chapter, which is about networks and groups and so the places you belong somehow, or you feel you belong, I talked about these silent revolutions and the term Wúwèi, which is really one that comes from Taoism. And we all know Taoism and the path and the journey. And so I'm not going to go into the whole story about that everything will be okay if you just let it all go. But the reality is that within this concept of non-action or inaction, which is a wrong translation of the Wúwèi concept, it's more about knowing when to act and knowing when not to act. And it means that when the flow is right and the water goes fast, you actually should do more. And when it's actually counter current, then you should maybe just hold off for a while and wait for a while. And this sounds logical, but in the West, and specifically where I'm from, I mean, we tend to go against the current constantly because we believe that revolutions is the only way to change society. And so if we look at our past, this is also often in history shown that revolutions has created a big change. And so without these revolutions, I mean, feminism, I mean, lots of things like what we have with the Black Lives Matter right now, and a lot of these things, it's about revolutions to change behavior. But in China, many people feel that this is not allowed, you can't do that. So there's not change happening. And I think that's where the misunderstanding is. It's not because there's no revolutions, visible revolutions, that actually change is not happening. And so the Wúwèi is really an environment where it's about creating that power from within and knowing when the group, the network, should react because there's a positive flow on making it happen. And so sometimes things stand still. And when it stands still, actually it's building up energy and momentum. And that's what we don't see under the waterline. We don't see that momentum. And so once it's been built, actually when the momentum is right, that's the moment when suddenly there's like really a speedboat going really, really fast into the future. And so if we look at that, and that's why I call it silent revolutions, they're silent because they're hidden, but they're not silent anymore, or they're not revolutions anymore once they're not hidden. And so I think that's the concept that we often misunderstand in the West. The problem with that is that often you have to give it time. And the issue is that in many people who are on the other side of that revolution, who are actually harmed by not having change, they don't have the time, don't want to give the time, and that's totally understandable. And so they feel very frustrated that time will solve the problems. But that doesn't mean that within time, some problems aren't being solved. And so I think it's like a double speed China constantly. And if you understand that a little bit, it's easier to understand that most Chinese actually understand that you have to give it time sometimes, and then just speed up when you can. And so this is a little bit my time perspective towards trust. And for the West, it's very difficult to accept that because we don't want to give China time. But the interesting thing is, if you look at the past 30 years, I mean, China have changed more than any country in the world, even the government. And so maybe time is actually in their advantage because they're giving it time, but by doing that, they're actually leaping into the future rather than going into the future.
Yeah, and it reminds me of, I've recently come back from a trip in Europe, and it reminds me of the pizza making workshop that we took. And the guy was giving us all these ingredients and the dough, and, you know, and basically the dough is a masterpiece, right? And then ultimately the guy pauses, and he's been doing pizzas for 40 years. And he says, and now the most important secret ingredient And I'm standing there, my goodness, we've been working on this dough and then on toppings for 2 hours. I do not know what is this next most important ingredient. He says, we need to give it time.
Yes.
So time for him as a pizza maker was that super, super important secret ingredient. Talking about freedoms, yeah, because you've mentioned it multiple times, and this is probably one of the biggest kind of pain points that people highlight when they talk about, you know, China versus the West, but where's the freedom? Why do you say in the book that China is more free than we believe in the West?
Well, there's a few reasons, and I think I've explained a few already with the main misconceptions just earlier, and I do believe freedom, I mean, it's a very sensitive topic that to start with, because if you talk about this where you live in Hong Kong, it has a very different meaning than in Belgium or even in China. So that depending on where you live, the concept of freedom when it comes to China and Beijing is of course a very sensitive topic. But I did try to explain a little bit how the freedom within the Chinese culture and past has a different connotation. And so this is where I'm talking about the feeling of, and this goes back to my model of the collective and within the network, that being free is also about being protected in a way. And so as long as you feel that the people around you and that collective protects you, you actually feel free within that environment. And within the outer circles, the system, this is really about freedom as a liberation point of view rather than a limitation point of view. And so if you look at how many Chinese look at freedom, they look at it as an evolutionary setting, which means that they want to get more freedom in their concept of what they feel is more free. And as long as that continues, that freedom actually feels good for them because they feel every year that they are gaining something. A good example is the technology crackdowns on companies that we had in 2021, and where everybody was talking about, oh, Beijing is basically cutting on the freedom of tech companies. They're all going to go bust, and that's the end of capitalism in China. And so there was a lot of headlines like, yeah, this is the end of the world. But if you look at it, there's two things that happened there. And this is just one example. I have a lot in my book. But one of the things that happened is that for many people, having these privacy laws, having these anti-monopoly laws, actually for the SMEs, the small companies, and for the individuals, the buyers, the consumers, they felt they suddenly had something they didn't have before. So that is in a way an additional freedom that they gained, which we see as a limitation. They often, another group sees as a freedom. Now, for some companies like the EdTech companies, education technology companies, I mean, all their money went away. And so they basically, the companies were valued like New Oriental suddenly very, very little. But then you see a year later, I mean, just recently, that's not in my book, but you see that they've reshuffled and rethought about how the future should look like, and do live streaming with selling products. And so they find their way to their freedom. And of course, it's not nice. And for the investors, it's terrible who put money into these companies. But it doesn't mean that it's the end of the road. There's usually another path, another road. And so in the concept, the reason I believe that we think Chinese are actually less free than most Chinese feel themselves is because they constantly see new paths and new roads to that freedom that they attach so much importance towards. And so this is basically what I explained. But I also explained more about that we believe that they're living in fear of freedom, and that is not true at all. I mean, for most people, they're actually pretty free, and if you've done business in China, you don't feel that limited. I mean, people feel that they can do a lot. There's a lot of opportunity, and I think that's also creating a sense of freedom. But I mean, there's many things. I talked about censorship. I talked about lots of things in this chapter, and how, of course, this is a reality, but how Chinese have learned to live with that reality. and then do something with that creates different freedoms for them than we have in the West. And so, yeah.
That's a very powerful concept. And I think, again, it reframes how we think somebody else experiences, lives through, through this lack of such things. The next chapter actually also covers an interesting topic, which is the control, right? So how do you actually balance, or how does China balance progress with control? And you talk about it in your chapter number 6.
Yeah. So yeah, the 6th chapter is really about, of course, the party and the government, and so how basically leadership or government leadership is putting things onto the population and on the business, and that regulation and rules can happen very quickly and tough, and so there's little room to debate it and challenge it. And so I've explained that in the book on this cyclical way of thinking from China. And so what we see about that, it's not untrue. I mean, there are many limitations in China that are top down. And when Xi Jinping and Beijing decide something, I mean, it's really hard to do otherwise. But because we look at it that point of view, we forget that this is on the top of the cycle. And if you've lived in China, I mean, we both have lived in China a long time, you realize there's these moments where really everything is basically stuck. And you should, I mean, when there's a National People's Congress is happening, an Olympic Games or whatever, that's the moment where you should kind of relax and not do too much and not be too visible, because whatever you do, it's not going to help you. But what we think is that this is the norm. This is the standard in China. And the reality is, these are, like, when it's cyclical, these are the moments where it's on a top level. And that means that China, the government, could not keep it at that level constantly, because if they would do that, the country would not be manageable or governable. And so they need to decentralize constantly and give others power in the local governments and the companies, Alibabas, and they need this energy to get the country going. And so when it's tough, like with real estate, for example, right now, because it's getting out of hand, so chaos is happening, lots of control, but that is a time moment. And then at that point, most of the Chinese, in my view, they're already thinking about the next cycle and how they can actually benefit from that downward cycle from control, and how maybe something new in the metaverse is happening, or something new with blockchain is happening, and how they can jump on that train, because the next 3-4 years, Chinese government is not going to control that, because they have no clue what is happening. And because it takes time for anybody in the world to understand what is the next thing that is going to be big. And that is where they see the opportunity. And so my experience of China has always been, when things are in a control moment, that's when Chinese feel there's an opportunity for the future. And we see it as a moment of, oh, this is the end of China. And so I think that's what it was interesting and important for me to mention, that we should really look at China as a cycle, and see the moments in between the controls rather than the control itself, to see the opportunity, but also understand how the Chinese think, how the Chinese businesses think, and how the local governments are trying to position or reposition themselves constantly towards that next future. And if we look at it then China looks much less controlled than it actually is. But when it is controlled, I mean, in certain aspects, I mean, then you better just have a Wúwèi reaction and then not do too much, and just wait the storm gets over, and then try to think about that again. And financial, I mean, with the IPO, I mean, a year later or 1.5 years later, they want to go public again. And so it's happening. It's just, we don't believe it until we see it. And that's usually 2 years later. And then we don't write about the 2 years back again.
And I love it. You know, we say in business that you will never make your second million the same way you made your first $1 million, right? So, and in China, that concept is just brought into the next level, because you constantly reinvent yourself based on the opportunities, the environment, because the country is so connected and so kind of driven by the vision of the future of technology, and that vision is not set. It's the vision that is kind of broadly set, but it is evolving. That this reinvention of yourself as a person, yourself as the professional or business or an industry, right, is constant, ongoing, and it happens within government, as you've just now mentioned, as well, both regional government and otherwise. Beautiful. Moving on, when it comes to the world stage, because right now we spoke about China, but world stage, that's what a lot of people care about. Can we really trust China on some big topics that actually influence the broader world, such as sustainability, environment protection, and others?
Yeah, so this is a chapter. It's one of the biggest circles of trust or distrust that we have in the world, because we are very much, specifically in the West, we're very much concerned about the superpower that China is becoming, and so we're concerned that they would put their rules and way of thinking onto the world, which would then control us or limit us in our future evolution. And so I thought it was important to put everything that we have as a concern, as a worry, as an angst, really into context. And so I talked a lot about the things in the South China Sea, about what's happening in Taiwan. I mean, we know Africa, all these things. These are the things that we are really concerned about, and we should. We should, because China is becoming powerful, and we should understand what that means. But what I've done in the book is also give a little bit the Chinese way of looking at these things. And then I think the misunderstanding that we often have here, which is really that we look at China in the same way as we look at it from the West. And so we use our history, our experience, to project that to how China will behave in the future. And this makes total sense. But when we look at it from the Chinese history and Chinese culture, we're ending up somewhere else. And so will it be that, or will it be our way, or will it be somewhere in the middle? Nobody knows, but I think it's interesting to put these two next to each other. And so this is where, specifically when it's about the ecology and the planet, I've written quite a lot about it, because simply said, if China is not going to solve its pollution issue, we're not going to survive on this planet. So we're all going to die, and so that's not a good prospect. And so that's also not something that I think any Chinese want, and definitely not the government, because then they have nobody to rule or govern anymore. But the reality is that we need to understand the importance that this is for the Chinese population and for the Chinese government. It's really to have a more an environment globally that is actually conducive and can help to make it more healthy. They see this as a huge risk, just like we see it as a huge risk. And so I think instead of looking at it from purely what is the rhetorical and what did they do in the past and what do they do now, just look at the actions. And so my prediction, and we discussed this last time we met in Düsseldorf, is that I really believe that China is on a path to become the green factory of the world. And so they've been the cheap factory of the world, and then they've been the efficient factory of the world, and now they want to become the green factory of the world. And so if that is really their goal, because you see that they see that as the next big thing, I mean, it's not even about saving the planet, it's about making money. And so if you can make money by saving the planet in the same time, I mean, you're doing two great things. And so I do believe that China is on a path to become the green factory of the world. I mean, we've seen it in solar, we've seen it now in electrical vehicles. I mean, it's going in everything. I do believe that we should have more confidence that this will actually drive the green transformation. Not because they have an ideology of tomorrow saving the planet. I mean, they do from a long-term point of view, but from a short-term point of view, it's all about money. And so if we look about that, and we look about a lot of these things to protect their own future, we can even project this on the South China Sea and so on, then maybe it gives us a different view of looking at it. It's not about justifying what they're doing. It's more about understanding that sometimes the pragmatic way that China has can actually get the world to actually a better place or a more healthy environment. And so I think that's important when we look at the world and the superpower that China is. It's a worry, but at the same time, that superpower is an enormous energy that we could use for good as well. But how do we do that? It's again the topic of my book. It's about trust. And do we trust it? And we can, one thing that is sure, we can trust that Chinese will always want to make money.
Some things never change. Some things never.
No.
I love it. Then we move on to a very interesting story towards the end of our chat today, because we're almost at the final chapter where you're going to reveal the answer to this question that we were talking about. Can we trust China? So we're almost there, but not yet. I liked this story about 2001 Space Odyssey, and how China was given tools by the West to become the proud nation seeking, the rise, etc. Tell us the story, first of all, and tell us also, it's only been 20 years since that story essentially happened. What does this mean for the future of the world?
Yeah, so 2001 Space Odyssey, a movie from Stanley Kubrick, science fiction. It was made in 1968, so that's a long time ago. And that was just before America or NASA landed on the moon. And so he made a whole story around that America would land on the moon in 2001. Well, it happened in 69, so he was a little bit wrong. But basically, the whole story is really about how power and purpose and progress is being built because people want more and they want to go to other destinations. And so this is a science fiction movie into space. And I like the story because it creates actually a parallel to how China created its progress, its power, but also now its purpose. And that's the last part of my book, the 8th chapter. And so I related this in 2001, because in 2001, 3 things happened. And this has nothing to do with the movie, but it happens to have happened in 2001. The World Trade Center, which changed the world, the attacks on the World Trade Center, and where China started having a different view on how they should protect their own society, military and so on, and space exploration. So they have a lot of ambitions that started in 2001 because of the world that changed, and because China was not the enemy anymore in 2001, while communism was the enemy before that. It changed in 2001. And the other thing is that the access to WTO, so the World Trade Organization, which of course gave China suddenly an opportunity to sell to the world and became the factory of the world and so on. And we know the story, but this is all about suddenly they could play as an equal partner. And that is only 20 years ago. And we forget that it's only 20 years ago. And now that they've replaced America as the factory of the world within 20 years' time. And then the last part of the story is really about the Olympic Games in 2008. Which was actually decided in 2001. They won that bid then. And so it happens that in 2001, 3 big things happened that changed the world, because in 2008, that's when Chinese started feeling proud about their nation. That's when the world was looking at China in a different way. And so they had all these 3 things in 2001 that changed China. It changed China because they could have progress. This was the World Trade Center attacks that created this new world. It changed China from a superpower because the World Trade Organization allowed them to become the factory of the world. And now it's about purpose. And that's where I end my book, where the big difference between now and 20 years ago is that China is still seeking their own purpose, but they're not looking at the West as a reference point only. And 20 years ago, they were. I mean, the only reference point or the main reference point for China was the West. It was the world. And so they were copying literally and trying to emulate things because they thought this was the future for China as well. And today that is diverging. And so what you see now is that you see that they're still looking at lots of great things that we're doing, but they're looking to find their own path. And the interesting thing is that we consider this as being wrong because it's not our path. And maybe we should learn some of the things from that path, or at least watch it. And I think if we're not going to watch it, we're going to make mistakes because they're going to solve problems in different ways than we do. And then we're going to say, oh, why didn't we do that as well? And so this is where I think both on the governance side, on technology, on innovation, on consumer behavior, maybe the meta, I mean, everything is going to be different. But now is the moment to look at that difference. Maybe we should start copying China for some things there, and other things which say this will never fit in our society, and that's totally okay. So this is where I ended my book. And so we should have trust in the fact that whatever China does in the future could actually be interesting for us to watch, to learn from, because that way we could evolve as well in a different way, which could be beneficial for us and the world.
Absolutely. A very powerful idea that goes through the whole book. And now we have arrived to the moment of truth, to the grand reveal of, can we actually trust China? I know that you end a book with another interesting story. So tell us, please, what's your take on this very important question? Show us the book again so we can see the title. Guys, I'm doing a shameless plug here for Pascal. Do get this book. Yes, look at how many ideas are right there. Yes, Pascal, can we trust?
Thanks, Ashley. So no, I think first, to trust China, you need to read my whole book. So I think that's the starting point. I'm doing another marketing pitch here. No, I think the reality is that I don't see why we wouldn't be able to trust China differently than we trust our own country or countries around that. And I made a comparison in my book between Belgians and Dutch people. We're speaking the same language. We're basically, but we don't understand each other. And we have to really change our way of thinking and mindsets to do business with each other. But we're the two biggest trading partners with each other. So we constantly do business with each other. We help each other. We have similar views, but it takes an enormous effort to do that. And that's because we have actually agreed to let some things behind and to look at people and look at in different ways. And so the story is really about trying to empathize with a different culture. And the further away, the harder it is. So if it's already hard between Belgium and Holland, I mean, imagine it, China being on the other side with a different government, and so it's very, very hard. But if we do that, there's actually a way to trust China much more than we do today. That doesn't mean we have to have blind trust. We shouldn't have that even between Belgians and Dutch people. I mean, we shouldn't have blind trust as well. I mean, we need contracts, we need agreements, we need to have similar ideas at certain points, and we need to debate all these things. So, but we can have trust. And what I did in the book is I ended with saying, if we want to trust China more, which isn't something we have to do, but if we want to try, I've compared basically the trust in people in the network with how brothers trust each other. And that's, even if you have totally different character and you would never become friends if you weren't be brother or sister. I mean, brothers and sisters, they trust each other basically because they're part of the same family. And that's what China is about. So think about the brother from the people point of view, consumer point of view, the citizen point of view. But if you look at this, the system, think about a father that is pretty ambitious for you to achieve things in your life. And so he really wants the best for you, but he's also very strict and strong-minded. And so look at it from that father perspective to understand the system, the government in Beijing. And so it's a simple way to say, look at it from a family point of view, from a brother, look at it from a father point of view, from the system. Not to say that, I mean, my father helped me a lot in my past, but he was also very tough, and I never agreed with him when I was young. So the same is with China. You might not agree. But it's not because you don't agree that you shouldn't somehow respect the results that are achieved. And so I think that's what I end the book with, just a model, a way of thinking of China a little bit differently. And if you do, then if you then think about China as more evolutionary, very adaptive, very pragmatic, and pragmatic, I mean that in a positive way, then I think there's different ways to look at China and trust China more. And to be honest, I end my book also saying somehow like, is it still an option to distrust China? And that's a big question. So maybe that's for another book, but the whole question is, I mean, we don't have to accept everything from China, but if we constantly distrust what's happening in China, we might actually not benefit from anything that is happening in China, in Asia, in the rest of the world. And so we should look at it, at least try to see if there's a way to solve that trust or distrust issue that we have. So, but it's a positive note I end on. Not a negative one.
Absolutely, just like a good Hollywood movie that requires a sequel.
Yes.
And I also, I feel that there's a lot of when we talk about trust, trust, when lack of it comes with a lot of villainizing, right? So it's not just distrust; it's also villainizing that everything that comes out of this system, this company, this person, etc. So it's really trust and how much of a villain we think they are kind of comes together. And as you've mentioned right now, I think it's a beautiful ending, really thinking that everything that happens there is bad is not going to serve us well, but learning and coming together and learning to communicate and be a part of a greater good, understanding that we are all in the same boat. And ultimately, I agree with Yuval Harari's idea that the world in the past 10,000 years has always become kind of more and more unified one way or another, from millions of tribes to thousands to hundreds to right now a couple of hundred countries in the world, to a few even commonwealths / European Union / etc. other collections. Ultimately, hopefully at one point of our human development, we will just become the earthlings, and it wouldn't matter whether we are from Belgium or China or any other place in the world. We will be earthlings, and hopefully we will really understand it earlier than sooner, so that this journey is smoother, happier, and more kind of effective for all. Pascal, thank you so much for the past hour. You've done a tremendous job trying to answer a very tough question, touching on the points that can get virtually, a friend of mine in the political circle says that saying anything vaguely positive about China is very often in today's world a political suicide. So you've done a tremendous work thinking, analyzing, and also touching those topics that many people wouldn't want to touch or even try to answer. So thank you so much for this, guys. Once again, get the book if you want to learn more. Also follow Pascal. Exactly, there we are. Keep it right there. Also follow Pascal on his YouTube channel. I want to highlight, this is not a paid plug. This is pure awesomeness, not a paid plug. Follow him on YouTube for his ongoing thought leadership and insights, and very, very specific videos about topics such as technology and again, trust, the West, China, etc. It was awesome. Thank you very much. We're looking for the sequel to come soon. And guys, stay tuned for more videos to come as well. I hope that you got value out of this. And now you know a lot more about trusting China.